Growing up as a Bodenschatz, I kind of grew up with the mentality of the stoic, strong German man, where at family gatherings we sit around with a Yingling in one hand and a euchre hand in the other and play our cards and, talk about sports and the economy and not really get into anything of our feelings. It was just kind of the tone. Not that we couldn't share anything, but that was just the general vibe. And as I got into seminary, I realized that there was something in that attitude that needed to shift. Especially when I got into my sophomore year, the whole theme of the year was centered around this idea called masculine vulnerability. Not a topic that comes up in casual conversation, but that was kind of the point. To understand what it meant that this idea of being masculine doesn't mean that you're invulnerable, you can't be hurt. Sometimes it means that you have to be hurt in order to grow stronger. And so this is something we spent an entire year on with the view of this is what we're going to need in priesthood. Not a priest who doesn't feel any fear at all. Sometimes you should be afraid. But a priest who can feel fear, know what the right thing to do is, and do it anyway. And that's the virtue of courage. So we had all kinds of conversations. As sophomores in college, we were thinking to ourselves, can we really give up a family to live this life of priesthood? And in vulnerability, we'd have to share our desires and understand what does this mean in light of Christ and what he's calling us to do. And it's a whole house of guys. Especially when we'd play sports, we'd play way too hard, and people get hurt, and things are said that shouldn't be said. And we had to be able to talk that through. What you said made me feel this way. Can we figure this out? And when we would do that, those conversations that I got to have with my brothers, those guys became my best friends, even to this day. Those who I know are going to support me in this life as we're trying to preach the gospel and just do what God's asking us to do. But this whole idea of true connection, it required vulnerability. And I think this is the message that's inherent throughout our readings today, this Sunday. That vulnerability is required for forgiveness, to really show mercy. And that Jesus is inviting us today not to hide in our own woundedness, but to hide in his wounds that he received on the cross especially. And we see both what it looks like to hide in our own wounds and in the wounds of Christ in these readings. So as we look at this first reading today, we see King Saul, the first king of Israel, as a prime example of how to hide in our own wounds. He was terrible at vulnerability. He heard rumors, and he had this feeling that David was God's anointed and that David would receive the throne of Israel. And for Saul, he, in his insecurity, took that as a threat. And he convinced himself that David, who was his most trusted friend, was now his enemy. And so he took out his 3,000 best soldiers and went out to kill David. What could have happened if Saul would have been vulnerable with David and said, this is what I'm seeing. I see you taking my authority. I don't feel confident that God's blessing is still with me. What David would have said is what David said when he saw Saul asleep on the ground. He said, this is the Lord's anointed. Do not touch him. That conversation could have been had so easily, but Saul in his insecurity was hiding in his own wounds, as we so often tend to do, and not being willing to open up. But then Jesus gives us these great examples, all these radical teachings in the gospel today. Love your enemies, pray for those who mistreat you. To someone who asks of you, give and don't expect anything in return. Jesus is asking us to be totally vulnerable, that someone could take advantage of our good intent. But that's what's required for love. Love is always taken with a risk. And Jesus showed that to the maximum when he allowed himself to be given away to preach mercy, to preach the truth, to the point of being nailed to the cross. But his wounds are what healed us. By his blood that was shed comes our forgiveness. And the same way, when we pour ourselves out in love and allow ourselves to be vulnerable, that healing can come. That salvation that Jesus won for us on the cross can flow through the love that we show in vulnerability. And so much of this requires us to slow down, to really enter into the life of prayer, so that the Holy Spirit can guide us through the events of life, because things happen fast. And so often when we're overwhelmed, we're tempted to hide within our own wounds, to make our own conclusions, to judge and to condemn. But Jesus is asking us to slow down so that when these things happen, we're not relying on our own beliefs, but we can express in vulnerability the things that are happening and seek the truth and seek forgiveness. This happens so often in our families. This happens among our friends, our coworkers. Tough conversations where sometimes we were holding back what really needed to be said. So today's a good day to begin praying with Jesus and asking the question, can I be vulnerable even with Jesus himself? And can I be vulnerable with the people I need to be vulnerable to? What am I holding back that I've never said that I need to say so that I can be truly known? Because Jesus won't force his way in, and no one can pry the truth out of you that you're holding back. It's something that we have to let go of so we can be loved. And sometimes we have to be able to share what's hurt us in order to forgive someone who's hurt us. It's a risk, but God's grace is always at work when we take that risk. And he says in the gospel today, your reward will be great in heaven. So even though we don't always see that reward of being loving and vulnerable, every single one of those acts is a reward waiting for us in heaven, because Jesus himself was vulnerable and gave us salvation through that life of taking risks and giving up himself. And so it is for us too. We share in that reward whenever we are vulnerable and love with risk. So this is what it means to hide in the wounds of Jesus Christ. Don't hide in your own wounds. Don't let that fester. Let the truth be known, and run to Christ at the cross and bring the truth to him. Hide in his wounds, and peace and forgiveness truly can be yours.